not surprised that gender has been added to the textbook. I think when we look at all the things that are shifting based on this idea of what gender means, it's just there's just huge conceptual shifts in how people are viewed. So one of the things I would say, first of all, is certainly from when I was growing up, this binary model of masculine and feminine certainly was predominant. The idea of what I think about actors, because I think actors are always sort of portraying, oftentimes, I guess not always, I mean, less so now than it was when I was younger, but certainly they are portraying what it was in the past to be masculine and what it was to be feminine. And then when people broke those rules, then there was just a huge taboo and people were very upset about it. And now there is sort of more acceptance as far as the way that gender is viewed. So I look in the textbook and it mentions BIM, and I remember taking the BIM androgyny scale back in the 80s and finding out that I was relatively androgynous. And what that means is that on a scale of masculine to feminine, I'm actually hanging out more towards the middle, where I have characteristics of both. There's probably people that you've met that may be very very typical of what a feminine person is and very typical of what a masculine person is. And then there's people that sort of fall in between. And, I don't know, I haven't taken it recently, but I think I'm curious to take it again just to see where we fit. But the idea of a person being androgynous, meaning that they're showing both male and female characteristics, I think is much more acceptable now, certainly as far as how a person presents themselves, and the idea that it's not as easy to tell, what sex someone was birthed as. So the polarization of gender, I think, has shifted. So what we want to do is look at defining gender, looking at this idea of sex, gender versus sex, and how they're defined. Understanding that gender is learned and then gender is socially constructed. So let's start with this idea of polarization and this idea of being fluid as far as how a person presents themselves. Again, I think parents, when children are initially born, they're going to be identified by their gender. There's going to be certain things that parents do, like they're going to put you in a pink blanket or a blue blanket. They want to make sure that people know what gender you are. I think people have gotten upset. I've heard people get upset that the people couldn't recognize what gender they were and they're a baby, and the babies don't necessarily show what gender they are. They just look like a baby. And people, making sure that the appropriate color is surrounded their child so that people know what gender they are and call them by the appropriate gender. Yeah, I think that's shifting, and some amazing things that are happening now are many people that are transgender or, were born with one gender and choose to represent as a different gender. I don't know that it's always really a choice. I think that sometimes they just feel like they're in the wrong body, and although they were born in a male body, they feel like they're female. And the idea that that parents that they knew at a very young age that they were represented in the wrong body, and that some parents are accepting this from their children at a very young age and allowing their children to express themselves however they want. So the shift in society and societal norms, are really allowing people to express what they're feeling inside and whatever identity or gender that they choose to represent, or even if they choose not to represent as any particular gender, that's now becoming more acceptable. I think it confuses some people because they're not sure how to refer to them, but it does give people choices where the choices didn't exist in the past. And I think that includes a person that chooses to represent themselves as purely one gender or another. So yeah, we have choices, and I think that's a beautiful thing. When we look at sex is oftentimes referred to as the atomical biological distinction. Whatever external genitalia happen to be on the person, that just defines what sex they are. Their reproductive organs, their hormones, the chromosomes, what they've been assigned at birth, because we generally have a male or a female identity. And then gender identity is more like the way the person chooses to represent themselves. So gender is external. It's a sense of being. There's this idea of a person being opposite their gender, and then cisgender means that they are the same gender that they were born with and they choose to represent themselves that way. We can look at some really interesting ideas that have happened across time. One of them is this idea, it used to be called hermaphrodite, meaning that the person was born with external genitalia that represented both genders. And I think in the 50s and 60s, a decision was made about which way they were going to go. I think if that happens now, often parents will allow the child to develop and then figure out what gender. If they need to make changes to that, then they'll allow the child to figure out what gender that is. But I remember when I was studying sociology in the 80s and 90s, I remember there being a scenario that was offered, and one of the scenarios that was mentioned was a young man who was born in the 50s or 60s, and was having a circumcision, and there was some kind of power surge that happened. And in the process, his external genitalia was burned off, meaning that he had nothing on the exterior to show that he was male. And the parents had a choice of what gender to have the child be. So again, this was in a period of time when there really wasn't, you were either one gender or another, pretty much. And the parents made the decision, even though he was born a male, to have him do everything and represent as a female. Now, when I took this class in sociology at the time, there's this idea of nature versus nurture. Is who you are determined based on how you were raised, or is who you are determined based on characteristics of who you are? So in this particular case, they decided that this little boy should be raised as a little girl. And at the time that I read his story initially in the 80s or 90s, I don't remember when it was, when I read this story initially, he was doing okay. He was being raised as a girl. Everything was being shown up as a girl. And he was accepting that role as a girl. Well, then I teach sociology, I think it was probably 6 years ago. I'm teaching a sociology class and the story shows up again, but I get to have the ending to the story. And what happened in this story was that this little boy ended up being much larger than the other girls because of the testosterone that was originally in the body, and they had given him estrogen at a very young age, so trying to counteract that. Of course, he was attracted to girls because, that's what his orientation was, so that's what he was comfortable with. And he was very confused by everything as he got older. And so there was this disconnect between what he felt inside and what was going on the outside. And the story ends with him committing suicide. And I think, there's challenges going on now with these elements where where there's so much confusion going on in the teenage years and as a person gets older, and they're getting confused and they end up unfortunately being so confused that they take their own life. And truly it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable that we live in a society where somebody feels so uncomfortable being in their own skin that they choose not to be here anymore. So I think that's an interesting example of how gender shows up. How making a decision for someone based on, oh, we're just going to raise him as a female and then he'll be a female, clearly didn't work because he didn't feel like a female. There's no part of him that actually came out that way. So just an interesting case. And then, it looked hopeful in the 80s or 90s, whatever that was. And then looking at it now, just a totally different experience of what that looks like. And yeah, so gender is kind of imposed upon you. It starts before you're born. They find out through the ultrasound. You're named a certain name. You're given certain clothes. There might be a gender reveal to show who you're going to be. The gender of a child is a big deal, and there's a lot of effort and information put into that where, people are very excited about whether they're having a boy or a girl. It's a category and a way of defining a child or a baby in a specific way. There's specific appropriate behaviors and conformity in toys. I think I mentioned before the Dick and Jane books that I grew up with. And there was very clear roles. If you look at the Dick and Jane book, Dick was trying to be like his father. Jane was trying to be like her mother. And Dick would be out there following his father, mowing the lawn. And Jane would be out there, cleaning and working in the house and pretending like she was vacuuming the carpet so she could be like her mom. So the gender roles are very defined. And in looking through the book, I actually have a 1955 Dick and Jane reader that's in pretty good condition. And it's fascinating to see how clearly they were defined. And when we look at TV, we look at media, it's a reflection of what's happening in the culture at that moment. So initially, when we look back, it was a very different person that was, the genders were clearly related or very clearly defined, back in the 80s and 90s. But when we look at them now, I think there's much more fluidity, much more acceptance of there being something different. I worked with some young kids. I normally work with 4th and 5th graders, and I was working with some preschoolers. I just kind of didn't know what to do because I really like having conversations. So that's why I like the 4th and 5th graders. But then I was put in a situation where I was working with preschoolers, and I'm like, I don't even know what to say to them. I wasn't sure what to do. But I was just kind of sitting back and I wanted to see what toys they played with, because there was a little kitchen area for them to play in. Then there were some more traditional male-oriented toys like train and cars. And I noticed that although there was more commonality in playing with toys that were related to the gender, that there were also kids that were playing with toys that were not related to their gender. That the little boys were playing in the kitchen, but they didn't, they were just being creative in how they're interacting with things in their environment. So I think, we are seeing shifts in that and just more acceptance of of it not being binary, of that there being more fluidity in how it's being done. So, we look at how it's learned, and there's so much being forced upon children as far as how things are done, as far as expectations and doing things that are oriented along the lines of whether it's a boy or a girl. And the idea of gender is socially constructed. So we talked about Yuri Bronfenbrenner's model of socialization and how we learn to be who we are. And the 5 big categories that they looked at were family, peers, school, community, and media, and how each one of those sort of influence how you become who you are. So there's norms associated with sex. There's associated restrooms. There's educational training. I remember taking sex education training in, I think it was 6th grade, maybe, for me. I think it's different now, but, you know, and there were little videos that you were watching about how your bodies were different, and the expectations about what was going to happen to you when you got older, and what what sex was supposed to. It wasn't, they didn't really talk much about sex, to be honest with you. It was more like expectations, and of course abstinence was more of the focus, certainly during the period of time that I was growing up. So there's educational training. And now we're starting to see some shifts as far as how this goes, where we have family restrooms, or restrooms that aren't necessarily oriented towards one gender or the other. On campus where I teach, there are family restrooms, or yeah, non-gender oriented restrooms, where it's just basically an individual stall where someone would go into the individual room and have a choice. And as the new buildings are being built on campus, they're adding this idea, this bathroom that is not oriented towards a specific gender. I had a student years ago. I had a hard time because I knew what gender they were, and I kept referring to them by the gender they were born, the sex they were born with, rather than the gender they chose to represent. And they kept correcting me, and it was so disrespectful of me to not recognize them for the gender they wanted to be. I remember the student, we were in an office building. The school was located in an office building, and there were different floors in this office building. And so what the student would do, so they didn't have to worry about the bathroom situation and going into a specific bathroom, they went to whatever floor they wanted. They went to one of the other floors, and they went to the restroom that that was appropriate for them. So trying to navigate this based on the the gender fluidities is certainly a challenge, and what happens there. So yeah, gender, I think, is an important element as we're going through and looking at this, because I think we're all generally categorized or classified, and as time goes by, I think this becomes less and less of a classification and more of just an element of who that person is, and maybe the gender not being important. There's certainly names that a person can have that aren't oriented towards one gender or the other, or they were, but you'll see somebody with a name that is generally associated with a different gender. So, you know, it's just not, it's becoming, I think, less important as time goes by, but I think it's important to discuss because um, it's part of the conversation, and people need to understand how that's shifting and how that's becoming different. All right, there you go.